Welcome in, and thank you for making the Hoops Cap Pod part of your daily routine, your home for UConn men's and women's basketball. We're available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Big East Energy Podcast Collective, where passion meets precision. We have T. Baker on the program with us today. As you guys already know, we're transitioning all of this stuff from Locked On UConn, and we appreciate all of your support. If you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. It's the Hoops Cap Pod. You can find it on Apple and Spotify as well. We're proud to say we're the only daily podcast covering both the UConn women's and men's basketball program, the Hoops Capital of the World. If you haven't figured it out, Hoops Cap Pod is an abbreviation of the Hoops Capital of the World, and we're thrilled to bring you that coverage because you deserve it. All right, T. So the biggest thing about this women's basketball kind of weekend, as we're recording this on a Friday, is obviously the games, but reflecting back on JuJu and Paige, the matchup that everyone kind of seems to want in this tournament is going to have to wait until they both are playing in the WNBA, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, that appears to be the case. It's just absolutely devastating. I've seen a fair share of ACL injuries. We know that women's athletes are disproportionately more impacted by ACL injuries, and it's actually one of the epidemics of the sport in recent years. And part of the problem is that not a lot of the medical research that's conducted on ACLs is conducted on women, and that's a problem and a growing concern in the sport. But beyond that, sometimes it's just the bad luck, and JuJu got snake bitten this time. And I mean, it's just heartbreaking, right? I think beyond the narratives and the brands and all the things that JuJu represents, it's just a kid who's wants to hoop, and
Right.
She can't now, and that sucks. And so I think what I've been really interested on is like now how it's almost felt like the narrative has switched to like it was Paige versus JuJu, but now it's got to be Paige, and there's this immediate shifting of the spotlight to another superstar. And I don't know, it seems like that's part of the narrative ESPN particularly wants us to follow, right? Is that there's this one star. And I think for me, that's one of the challenges or shortcomings with the women's game, is that oftentimes it seems like there's this like savior complex about one superstar is going to like bring women's basketball into the new era, when in reality there's so many great players, there's so many great stories, and I think sometimes we get caught up in the superstar narratives.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and I think part of that is whether it's the women's game or the men's game, it's like you're searching for people to latch onto. I'll share some dirt on when I first started doing the women's show at Locked On. One of the things that producers said to me all the time is every thumbnail you do should be Paige, and I was just like, no. and I don't mean that to be kind of like, oh well, screw them. Like that wasn't the case. It was just like, I'm going to go with what makes sense. Like for the most part, when you cover UConn women, all of the coverages, a lot of it is about Paige anyway. So it was like 80% of it was going to be her anyway. But if Sarah Strong had a monster game or AZ Fudd had a monster game, I wasn't not going to put them in the picture that shows them doing the things that they did well in that game. So I totally understand where you're coming from when it comes to that. But do you think that they're doing that just because they want to maintain the momentum of the interest that was created by the Caitlin Clarks and the Angel Reeses of the world with Paige and others?
For sure. And don't get me wrong, like superstars are compelling. The NBA pushes LeBron and, they're superstars, so, I mean, I don't want to sound like that this is like something that's unique to the women's game only. I think sometimes the stakes are higher though with the women's game. It's like this one person is going to save the game, and the game doesn't need saving. The game's been around. It's grown steadily over time. Last year was a moment of exponential growth, but you can't sustain interest in a sport when you're just putting it on the shoulders of one person. And I think sometimes women in particular in sports get caught up in this trap of you're going to be the one to make the sport relevant. You're going to be the one to make people care, when, people are beginning to care just because it's a good product and because it's good basketball and because there's a lot of compelling stories. And that's the direction I'd like to see the sport continue to go.
Yeah. And conversely, we talked about this pre-show, that they do it with the men too. Like Cooper Flagg is all over ESPN's coverage because Duke is now in the Elite Eight. They just beat Arizona in a really great game, and deservedly so. He had 30 points in a Sweet 16 as a freshman. He's going to be the number one pick in the draft next year. So I think it's mostly because for years on both sides of the aisle, men's and women's, you're trying to promote the stars that were coaches. You know, on the women's side, you had Geno and Pat Summitt. Then you in Muffet McGraw and Tara Vanderveer. And on the men's side, for years, it's Coach K, it's Roy Williams, it's Jim Calhoun. So it was always Jim Boeheim. These players. I mean, think about it. Carmelo Anthony played for Jim Boeheim, but Boeheim's more of the star in college basketball than he is.
Yeah.
And I say that like, you know, people may disagree with that, but the reality is that's the truth. Like Boeheim is a institution in college basketball. Carmelo was there for a year. So like that's the difference is I think they try to do coaching, but now since we're kind of in this player era where it's NIL, it's you know, player empowerment, then they're trying to shove the superstar narrative, you know, in our faces again.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point. And as you were talking, I was thinking, you know, part of the reason probably on the men's side the coaches are featured is because the men were leaving after a year, right? And still are.
Yep.
So like I think with Paige, we saw this arc, right? We saw her as like a freshman and player of the year, and then we saw her go through her injuries. Like, so there's a story here about her in her college days that we don't get on the men's side. And I think that's disappointing. I don't watch a lot of men's basketball, to be totally honest with you, but I think that's one of the great things about the women's game is that we do get to see players.
If they stayed, if the men had the same restrictions as the women do for going pro, would you watch it more?
I think I would. I think I'd be more invested in the players. Because I've always been interested in how players. I think that's one of the beauties of college sports. You see players grow, you see them develop, you see them really, you know, come into their own. And I think we've seen that at UConn over the years. Like Paige is a very different player now because she's had 5 years of coaching from Geno and CD and that coaching staff. And I think it's very interesting to see. And I think as a writer, as a journalist, that creates more compelling narratives about these players than they were here 1 year and then went to the NBA. You know?
Right.
So,
true.
Yeah.
No, it's true. And then, you know, there's obviously success stories on the men's side of coming for 1 year and just like, you know, Stephon Castle win Rookie of the Year this year in the NBA. And last year he came and they won the national championship. So, you know, like these are, you know, but those are few and far between. And you know, for every Steph Castle, there's the Andre Drummond who was here for a year and is has an amazing like money career in the NBA, but I wouldn't consider him a superstar, right? So those are the, I guess, the kind of the you know, the arcs of the men versus the women. One more question on this, and then we'll move to an Oklahoma preview, and really just kind of more centered around UConn. What have you seen from AZ, another kind of superstar in the mix with UConn? In these first two games, I have seen a player that looks, and I'm gonna knock on wood, like she's moving in a way like she hasn't in years, and the confidence is building. She just looks fantastic, and it'll lead into our Oklahoma and Elite Eight-ish preview. They look unbeatable.
Mm-hmm. They look real good. They look real good. And in, you know, covering the team the past couple of years, I always had this uneasy feeling as UConn entered, you know, the regionals, the Final Four, because it felt like the margin for error was so small. Mm-hmm. And I think Geno said this, the margin for error is much wider now because there's so many players. If Paige is off, you got AZ. If AZ's off, you got Serah. If all three of them off, you might have a problem, but that's not likely to happen, right? And I think that's what's so special about this team. I think AZ is just coming into her own. And, you know, I think it's another thing of like, as we talked with JuJu, it's like sometimes injuries just are heartbreaking and can really take your love out of the game. And I think with AZ, I saw that in the past couple of years, just like frustration and that love of the game is taxed. But I think after the game, second round in the stores, just looking into her eyes, seeing she's glowing. She has a brightness in her eyes, and I think she's playing loose, and that's why she's excelling because she's just hooping. And I think she's gotten some of those mental roadblocks out of the way, and that's scary for other teams.
Yeah. Also, like I love the article recently. I forget who, and I would love to give credit to. I don't know if it was Connecticut Insider or Hartford Courant, but about how essentially she was like challenging Geno, like, I'm not a princess, like challenge me, like stop, like, you know what I mean, like, you know, don't you know, treat me with kid gloves essentially. And so I think that is like a testament to her growth, that she's, you know, been like, hey, like challenge me, like I'm just as tough as any of the other players. Just because I've had injuries doesn't mean you can, you know, you have to like, you know, be, you know, wary of what I'm gonna say. And it shows. Like she's I love that she's taking it to the hoop more. Like she's got an incredible body and the respect that her body control, getting to the rim and not feeling like she always has to be the 3-point shooter. So I think that's really expanded her game as well.
I think the other underrated part about AZ Foot is her defense. Like she's a tough defender. She's got a build that can push you around. Like watching her play defense there's intensity there,
Yep.
and I think that's an underrated aspect of her game. So I'm pretty jazzed she's coming back, and but I know she's got her eyes on the next couple games, and hopefully she continues on that trajectory.
Were you surprised that she's coming back?
No, I wasn't surprised. The WNBA this offseason is working on their collective bargaining agreement. Salaries are likely to double or triple. If I'm AZ Fudd, I'm going back to UConn where, she's the people's princess. That's what they call her locally. I'm not taking a 75K WNBA salary and, going to a new team on the bench. So she made the right move, in my opinion, and she's got good people around her. Her parents are at every single game. And, I think they really like the journey. So I think she has an opportunity next year, again, knock on wood, injury pending, to step into the leadership role of this team and really be the focal point. And I think that's exciting to consider.
Absolutely. Well, let's transition from the focal point of next year to the focal point of this year, which is the Oklahoma game, Sweet 16, 31st straight Sweet 16. Every time I say that, I'm like, yes, that's the real stat. It's such an interesting, and also, by the way, 15 of the last 16 Final Fours for UConn. It's silly. And they're playing Oklahoma. They just got the number 1 recruit in the country, which is kind of wild, right? Aaliyah Chavez. It's a rematch of the 2002 national championship game. The Sooners have never beaten UConn. They're 0-13. What do you want to see from this game? This is we talked about betting on UConn a couple of episodes ago. The UConn women are the largest spread. Like they are the odds-on favorite right now to win the national championship, even more so than South Carolina. They're a 14.5 point favorite in this game. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, Oklahoma's a good team. I think earlier on I made some predictions that they're a team that could, make a run in the NCAA tournament. They had some good SEC wins. They have a really good coach in Jenny Barancic. She's in her 4th or 5th year there now and has really turned that program into a really respectable program. It's always had a legacy. But I think it's sort of in a different space now in the SEC and just kind of, earning respect. So I really like the Sooners program, and it's great for them. They got the number 1 recruit, and they seem like on a good trajectory. I think what I am concerned about for the matchup wise is just their post presence. Like they had 72 rebounds in the first round game and 64 rebounds in the second round game. That's a lot of rebounds. And in fact, it's a record in the NCAA tournament. So we talked a lot about UConn's potential weaknesses in the post. So I'd like to just see solid performances from Jana and from Ice. And I think that those come in different forms. Again, it's not lighting up the stat sheet. It's just being able to get rebounds, to box out. Ice Brady helps them stretch the floor because she has a mid-range game. So I think they just need to do what they do, and UConn needs to hit their shots. I'm not concerned about an upset here necessarily, but UConn does have to game plan around that post presence of Raegan Beers, who, spurned UConn in the transfer portal last season, which I think is just a fun other narrative to play.
Yeah.
Into. But that's the thing. It's 2 different styles. UConn's very guard heavy, and they're very post heavy.
Do you think that UConn's press will be a hindrance for Oklahoma? Because that's where I feel like they could potentially, where they're lacking on potentially the offensive rebounds and rebounding aspect, like you just mentioned. I do think that they can kind of take control of this game the way they have lately with the way their defense is playing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, UConn's defense is stifling. It's being in Stores for the second round game. I was, in the NCAA games, we get to sit courtside at Stores, which we don't in the regular season. You see how physical, how intentional, how much communication happens on defense. And it's just, it's really beautiful to watch. I think, one thing Geno said was that, Jamel Elliott says he doesn't give UConn's defense enough credit. He's always critical of it, but I mean, they know how good their defense is, and the coaching staff at UConn, like that's their bread and butter. It's always kind of been hard work on defense into transition. That's been the style for UConn, right? And so I think that's their advantage, and that's why I don't anticipate an upset. I think they just are going to stifle the Sooners. And but I think that post piece, like, they might get out rebounded, and that's something they just have to kind of navigate. Is they have other strengths, they have a different style of play, and they have to compensate for that piece.
Yeah, hopefully what I want to see from this team is not have a repeat of Tennessee or Notre Dame. Even I know they weren't full strength at Notre Dame, but essentially all of the 50-50 balls went to Tennessee, and that's why they lost that game. Because there was a moment in that game where they were up, I think, like 6 or 7, and they probably could have went and ran away. But Tennessee started to make a couple shots, and then like all these little things started to happen. And as you know, and it's a one and done situation, it's survive and advance type game, that can easily happen in this scenario. And I really hope that doesn't happen. I don't think it's going to happen. I think this team has been more focused on the little things that need to be done to win than it ever has been in this season in particular. And I really do feel as if this team continues to play really well and wins this game. I think I did a preview with Bella, and she said she thinks it's more of like a 12-point game. I honestly think they win this game going away. I don't think it's going to be 30 or 40 points like they've been beating teams the last couple games, but 15 to 20 potentially, because UConn's, you used a great word. I love the word stifling. The defense is so stifling that, to me, UConn's defense is like compound interest. Like, you put $5 in the bank and all of a sudden you have 30. Like, it's just, it happens. Like, a 5-point lead mushrooms to 12 in a blink. And it's just, that's just part of the strength of this team. And I think it continues. And who stops Serah Strong? That's the other part.
Yeah, I think that's the piece. Is like, Serah Strong is not necessarily your traditional big, but she is. That's because she's dynamic in so many other ways. It's not because she can't get rebounds. It's not because she can't play in the post. So she kind of anchors them in the post. But I think Jana and Ice play such an important yet maybe underrated role on this team to hold down that role of getting rebounds, getting blocks, trying to just mix it up a little bit in the post. So I think between the three of them, they've really created a good balance in the way they're handling their rotations, going big, going small. I think they have a good thing going. And so I agree with you. I don't think it's going to be particularly close, but there might be some times where those putbacks from Oklahoma are frustrating, and they just have to adjust to it.
As we know, 3 is bigger than 2, though. So if they shoot the 3 the way that they're capable of, 2-pointers and paint touches don't matter as much. And that's for the old heads, that's maybe a sad part of basketball today. But man, the way Paige played the other night, the way they shot it, the way they were able to play defense, I feel very comfortable going into the Sweet 16.
Yeah, and I mean, it brings us into kind of, I know another thing we want to talk about is just like UConn is recruiting bigger in the future. Yeah. And it's interesting. I heard Geno talking in a scrum about just like, there's a shift happening in women's basketball back to the basket traditional post player, and players like Lauren Betts. I mean, Dawn Staley's made her money on having post players. It was Asia Wilson, it was Aaliyah Boston. Now it was Camila Cardosa and Ashlyn Watkins. Like, so there's this move back to the traditional, back to the basket post player, which I just find fascinating, the way things cycle in sports. And I think, 2008 was a really fascinating year in women's basketball, because Candace Parker was on the rise, but she had to beat Sylvia Fowles in the Final Four. And Sylvia Fowles was almost what some people thought is like one of the last vestiges of those back to the basket bigs. And then you had Candace, who just really blew it all up. She could do everything. She was a big, she was a ball handler. Right. She was something like the sport hadn't seen. And I think we moved towards that with players like Stewie, Elena Deladon, bigs who could do it all and had guard like handles and presence. But I mean, I've always loved, you could call me an old head too, I guess. I love the post presence. I love a big post player. I've always loved that back to the basket, tough rebounding, aggressive post player. So I do love to see it. I'm curious what you think, like in the women's game, if you think that's something that is compelling, or if more people are moving just towards like Caitlin Clark hits a 3 from the logo and that's what we want to see.
Yeah, I think it's both. I like both, and it's because I think they both have a place, right? I love that, you know, you can call it the Steph Curryification of the women's game, where Caitlin is, you know, shooting from the logo the way someone like Steph kind of, because even when you go back to the NBA or the men's game, that wasn't happening all the time in the men's game. Like, he created that. And so, you know, Caitlin kind of doing that on the women's side. But, you know, I still think there's a place for the efficient, you know, Paige Bueckers to the mid-range game. If there's one thing I love more about the women's game than the men's game, it's that the mid-range game is still a thing, right? You know, like yesterday I watched a game where the Alabama point guard, you know, pulled up from like 15 feet. And it was only the second time that happened in their run to the Elite Eight. Like, only 2 mid-range jumpers in the entire run. And they had the stat, right? So, and he made it. So it wasn't like it was a bad, right? It's just crazy, right? Yeah. So like, so it's at least for the women, it's more well-rounded. Like, you have people like Paige was in her bag the other night, and she showed her full gamut of game, whether it's mid-range, threes, you know, almost post presence to a certain extent, passing. So I feel like on the women's side, you do have to be a little more well-rounded. And so also a very long way to answer this question, which is the post game, I think on the women's side, yes, it's definitely more traditional, but the Camila Cardosas and the Lauren Betts don't grow on trees. Like, there's not too many 6'7", 6'8" women like running around. And so it's a little tougher to kind of have that post presence, but the 6'4", 6'5", like, that's more like traditional in that respect. And I do love to see that. Like, I think it's definitely has its place, because it creates spacing on the floor. Like, you actually have to account for it, versus on the men's game, you typically don't.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the critiques of the NBA has just been, it's become like a 3-point shootout, and there's none of that physical. And I agree with that. Like, I mean, I feel frustrated watching the NBA a lot of the time, because it just doesn't feel like the product I want to see, right? And I don't know what that is, but it's not that.
No, it's true. And like, and then I'll take it a step further, because, you know, because we're talking about UConn, and a UConn player that's been on the men's side, that's been literally in the G League for like 4 years, is Adama Sanogo. He was one of the best players in college basketball, born in the wrong era. If Adama Sanogo was born in the 70s or the 80s, he'd have been dominating the NBA, because he's 6'8", 6'7" right? And has like literally a ballerina like footwork. And so can score on anyone in the post, but no one posts up anymore. So like, if you can't hit a 25-foot 3-point shot and you don't have handle, you're kind of stuck in a time warp. You know what I mean? So that's a phenomenal point, and it's true. There's some really good players out there that don't have a place in men's professional basketball, and that's one thing I love about the women's game that hopefully will continue to be the case. Like, I hope it doesn't turn into a bunch of Caitlin Clarks just running around chucking up threes.
Yeah, I like the mix of play, right? I like the dynamic nature of, you know, having post players who can body in the post, and also, you know, really elite guards who can shoot the three. But also, like you said, the mid-range game's exciting. I think the drives to the basket it's a really pretty brand of basketball that I enjoy.
Without a doubt. All right, so let's segue into that the third segment of the program. It's kind of like a joint UConn's portal pursuit and going bigger for next season. You know, there's confirmed reports, and I talked about this probably about 3 weeks ago, about UConn pursuing Serah Williams from Wisconsin. Correct me if I'm wrong. She was either the Big Ten player, the defensive player of the year. I know she was first team all defense. She obviously 6'4", 19 points, 10 rebounds per game. What do you love about Serah Williams? And what do you think? Two-part question. What do you think the chances of us landing her? And what would she bring to UConn next season?
I mean, I think what she brings is just more versatility and depth at the post position. I think that's really been UConn's weakness or vulnerability over the past several seasons. I mean, they've had players like Ayanna Patterson who haven't been able to play. Olivia Nelson-Adota, you know, I think has really evolved into a good pro, but on the college game, couldn't really be as physical in the post as we needed. And there wasn't as much of a depth at the post position. So I think she adds depth, first of all. She adds experience. I think Geno and his staff always tend to go for players who have played 3 or 4 years already in college, because you have experience at that point. You know, you bring in a different perspective. You've competed in postseasons. You've developed as a player, maybe developed some leadership skills. So I think that's the type of player, if you look at UConn's history of transfer portal recruiting, is players who have finished or are nearly finished their entire, years at another university. Maybe she graduated in 3, maybe it was COVID era and she took her 5th year at UConn. So I don't know what the likelihood is. I do know that she played for former UConn coach Marissa Mosley, who did resign under some fuzzy circumstances. So I'm not sure what all that means. I'm not going to speculate, but UConn connection perhaps that is there. So I think that she would be a great add. We know that UConn's also getting some other bigs next year in Gandy, Malou, Mamel, and Blanca Quiñonez.
I got you.
I knew I was going to miss. It's the pressure of the line. No. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to UConn bringing in some bigs and adding some depth at that position.
When not to harp on not being able to pronounce the name, because I do it all the time, but when I saw Blanca Quiñonez, I was just like, all right, someone with like Latin heritage, because that's right up my alley. That I have the tongue for it. I can say that. When it's like more Slavic or there's an issue, I definitely have more of an issue. So my Cuban background helps me when we talk about Latin players, even though she's Ecuadorian, first South American player to come in. I've watched so much film on Blanca Quiñonez that it's silly, but she's phenomenal. Like we'll talk about Gandy here in a second, but to jump to Blanca, she is so fast. Some of the moves that she makes in the in the transition game, and I know this is 1000% why Geno went and tried to get her, because she can get out on the break. Like I'm thinking of a world where you get a rebound from either Jana, or if Serah Williams comes, she outlets to KK Arnold, who kind of leaves it ahead for Blanca Quiñonez, because she's already going to be down there. Like she's literally faster than anybody that she plays now. So now when you put her in UConn's system, I just think she's going to be one of the next superstars for UConn.
Yeah, and I mean, her experience internationally, and again, we'll talk about Gandy in a second, also an international player. I think this is another pattern in Geno's recruiting, is recruiting really experienced international players. She's participated in FIBA programs. She was actually at the 2024 WNBA All-Star game in Phoenix as sort of like one of the rising stars of the global girls game. So, I think there's a method to that madness. It's really worked out, because international players just come in with a different level of experience, and I think maturity sometimes, because they've played professionally. They've been in this business, so to speak. It's just different in Europe. So in different, South America, different parts of the world, because, in America, it's very like AAU and there's a certain path that a lot of players follow in high school, but internationally it's very different.
No, 1000%. I talked about this a while back too. It's a great point where it feels like Geno is not necessarily like, I think people are worried about, he finally didn't get like a McDonald's All-American. And he's just like, well, don't worry. Like we have, what's it, more of a global brand. Like we're not going to go with McDonald's All-Americans. We're going to go with, the United Nations All-Americans with Blanca and Gandy. With Gandy, we had Kieran Quinn on, who essentially is her host family here in the States, in Jersey. And so the connection that they created with Chris Daly, and then obviously with Geno, was phenomenal. But her story, just in general, before we even get to her basketball, is one of crazy perseverance. If I'm being honest, I asked Kieran, do you think Gandy would want to come on the show? And he said, honestly, man, she's like all about business. Like she's super shy. Like she just doesn't want to be on camera, but she has no problem with me going on and talking about it. So when I did the interview with him, he talked about how her family, immigrated from, a war-torn country in Democratic Republic of the Congo to Ireland. And that's kind of like been her adopted home. Has, I think, multiple family members, like brothers and sisters who have special needs. Like she's got an incredible outlook on life. Like you talked about it being different in Europe and other places, just your circumstance can give you a lot of different perspective. Like when you go through the types of things that her and her family have gone through, now to have an opportunity to play at UConn is a win in itself.
Yeah, and I think that's Geno has always recruited kids who have had some different challenges. I think Geno is an immigrant from Italy. I think he relates to that immigrant story, and we've seen him have so many great players. Diana Taurasi, first generation immigrant. Nika Mule. There's several examples of it. And I think Geno really relates to that experience and that struggle of being in a new space and adapting to a different way of life. And I think that's just a really interesting sub narrative about how Geno continues to recruit international players.
1000%. To her ability. One of the things that Kieran told me is that she's been clocked rim to rim in like 4.2 seconds. Like she is an absolute blur. When she doesn't get a rebound, she's gone. Like when she gets a rebound, she kicks it out, and then she's literally trying to beat the post player down the floor. Like that's what he told me that she's going to excel in. She's a rim runner. She's got a raw offensive game. It's mostly going to be putbacks and like tip ins and things like that. She's listed at 6'6". Now he's 6'6", Kieran Quinn. He told me that she is a full 6'6", maybe even 6'7", because they're like eye to eye. And also sturdy, like not when you're getting Gandy, like you're not getting someone that's going to get pushed around as a freshman. So I'm super excited about her. She's a project. Defensively, you don't have to worry about her that much. It's more offensively. I don't think people are going to really. I don't think Geno's going to be designing any plays for Gandy, but I think she's going to help a lot with the size that they're bringing in.
Yeah, and I mean, when they announced her signing, Geno described that in some ways she's raw, and there's like you said, kind of a work in progress, a player who needs to kind of develop skill set, but has a lot of really great qualities. Runs the floor great, like you said, plays defense, rebounds, and UConn needs depth at that big position. So I think it's a good recruit and consistent with kind of what Geno's been looking for in the past several years.
1000%. Well, T, always a pleasure to have you on. Only thing I didn't ask you is what. I know you think UConn's going to win this weekend against Oklahoma. What's your prediction on score?
Score, I'm going to go with 84-68.
Okay. I like it.
What about you?
I mean, I think that score is great. I may copy you. No, I actually think they win a little bit bigger. I think it's going to be their defense is really good, so I'm going to keep them in the 60s. I think it's going to be 91-69.
Okay. All right.
Yep. I like 22-point win. But I also think they're going to push that like late. Like I think it'll be that 14-15 range for a while, and then they're going to push it, and then they'll hold on to it. It may drop to under that, but you know what I mean? Like, so that's why I like your score like in that 16 range, because even if they have a 20-point lead, Oklahoma maybe hit a couple threes at the end to kind of cut it to less than that. But I'm excited about it. Obviously, on the other side, before we go, do you think USC survives this Sweet 16 without JuJu, or do you think they're gonna kind of have a letdown?
I kind of do think they could beat Kansas State. There's still a lot of talent on that team, but who knows how they're going to come out mentally. I think that's the biggest test: is how do you recover from the emotion, from the sudden shift. Like I think they have the talent to win, no doubt, but Lindsey Gottlieb's got a tall task to get a team to kind of look ahead after something so terrible has happened to their friend and their best player. So I think that's what I'm interested to see, is kind of that mentality. But, I think the talent's there for them to beat K-State.
For sure. All right. He's T. Baker. I'm Mark Zanetto. This has been the Hoops Cap Pod. Subscribe. Where can they find your work, T, outside of, what you do here?
So yeah, definitely been posting a lot from NCAA tournament. I'm TBaker_WBB on Instagram, or MXTBaker on Twitter, or X, whatever you'd like to call it. So I will be continuing to post some content there, and going to Tampa next week. So hopefully we can check in from there.
All right. This has been another episode, Hoops Cap Pod. Go Huskies.